number 84. So on 84, I've got two question types I want us to look at. The first one is ones that I think a lot of times students feel pretty comfortable with, but in the past they've made some mistakes. So I want to try to help clear that up before you guys see it on a quiz. And then the second type on there is the question type that we avoided last class. So I'm going to show you how to do those and practice a few of those. And then once we do that, you can go back and finish handout 83, which would be the two questions that we skipped last time, because we will know how to do those then. And then finally, the other handout I gave to you guys today is the test review, and I'm just giving that to you early. But I am asking you to do the front page, which is questions 1, 2, and 3, because those are questions from section 3.1. And so if we do it now, it's going to serve two purposes instead of one. It's going to give you a little bit more practice before the 3.1 quiz, and then you'll have one page of the test review done, which of course you'll be grateful for in the future. And then finally, I will remind you of which handouts you should look at before our quiz. And I'm sure I'll say this again later, but you guys have your long weekend coming up, so I don't see you guys again until Wednesday of next week. So as always, I always suggest that you guys jot down about quizzes and stuff so that you don't feel caught off guard and you have some sort of way to remind yourself. But I feel like that's even more important over a long weekend, so because it is practically a full week before I see you guys again. Okay, so on the extra practice, these top questions, I would like you to try these 8 on your own first, partly just to help you see if you fall into these common traps or not. And so what we're asking you to do is try to pick out which ones you think are exponential growth, and you can just put EG by those. Exponential decay, which would be ED, or neither. So for those 8, to see what you would go with, and then that will help you focus in on what you may need to learn. A couple of these are just a little trickier than I think you expect. Okay, let's see how you did. So I'm going to start off on the ones that I think you were less likely to miss, and then work our way out here. So to be an exponential growth, without just graphing these is without a calculator. So if exponential functions are when the variable is in the exponent, I guess we can just go ahead and start off with the neither. That should be number 5 and 8, because neither of those have the variable in the exponent. X to the 4th rises pretty quickly, but it's not rising exponentially quickly. To be an exponential function, the variable has to be in the exponent. But then for exponential growth, if a is bigger than 1, so like 2 to the x, 3 to the x, that's when it was exponential growth. So that could be question 3, exponential growth. So I feel like that one's probably one of the more likely ones to get right. But also you need to be aware 6 and 7 are also exponential growth. 7 to the x is exponential growth. Multiplying it by 2 makes it rise twice as quick, but it's still exponential growth. And 7, 8 to the x is exponential growth. Multiplying it by a third is going to slow it down a bit, but it doesn't change the fact that it's still exponential growth. So don't let the times 2 and the times 1/3 throw you off. Those are still exponential growths. Exponential decay is when a is less than 1 but bigger than 0. We have to say bigger than 0 because if it's negative, that's when you flip it, it doesn't have anything to do with what type of exponential equation it would be. So the easiest one to see would probably be question 1. 1/6 to the x power is exponential decay. But the two that I'm most concerned with is question 2 and 4. Because these, even though it's tempting to say this is exponential decay and this is exponential growth, they're not set up this way. This little kind of shortcut works if it's some number to the x power. This is not some number to the x power, and this is not some number to the x power. It's to the negative x power. So you really need to remember an exponent rule, and I didn't mention it last class, but it wasn't a focus of ours. If you have a negative exponent, you can change it to a positive exponent by doing the reciprocal. Change a negative exponent to a positive exponent by taking the reciprocal of what it's being raised to. And then after you do that, then it's a little bit more obvious. This is exponential growth and that's exponential decay. So, of course, I hope that you caught that, especially these two, but just from what I've seen in the past, a lot of students overlook that, and that's not hard points to get. So if it does end up on our quiz this year, I just want to make sure that you have been exposed to that. Okay, you guys okay with 1 through 8? Anything you need to ask or follow up with that? Okay, you might mark the couple that would be good to look back at. Okay, and then this is the skill that I had you skip last time, partly just because I tried to remind you of a ton of information from Algebra 2 last year. So trying to balance out, not be too much, and then this was something that was actually new, and I didn't want to squeeze it in and rush it too much. But for these question types, I think that you will see my suggestion here of memorizing 3 different things will make these questions quite a bit easier. So if you have a number, any number, and his exponent heads towards 0, what do you think all of this is going to go to? 1. Good. Anything to the 0 power is 1, so that one's not too hard to remember. What about if we have a number and the exponent just keeps getting bigger? What's going to happen to all of this? If we have a number and the exponent just keeps getting bigger, it's just going to keep getting bigger too, right? This is already an insanely big number. This is move the decimal to the right 15 times. So if you have a number whose exponent keeps getting bigger, that whole thing just keeps getting bigger. In other words, it heads towards infinity. And then this one's a little bit harder to see, so we need to kind of write out the steps here. One of these steps will help us anyway. But if you have a number and his exponent heads to negative infinity, so it just goes down forever, remember a negative exponent is the same thing as moving it to the other side of the fraction to make it have a positive exponent. Now this denominator matches up with number 2 here, which means his denominator goes to infinity. And in a fraction, if your numerator is stuck still, but your denominator keeps getting bigger, if your numerator is stuck, but your denominator keeps getting bigger, do you see how it gets closer to 0? So it's good if you understand why that equals 0, but every one of these questions uses at least one of these 3 things, if not multiple of them. So just from past experience here, I feel like the first thing that you can do to help yourself out is know these 3 and actively be looking to apply them. Okay, so on to the actual questions now. Number 9, what I want to know about this graph without graphing it is what y value does he approach as the x values head to the left forever, and what y value does it approach as the x values head to the right forever. So the first thing you should do is just go ahead and plug this in. So pick one of them to work with. I'm going to do negative infinity first. Just put negative infinity in place of x. And then we got to figure out what this mess of stuff is going towards. And that's a lot to do in your head at once. So you want to try to break it into as many small pieces as you can. So I feel like we can deal with this part. This is one of the 3 things that I had suggested you memorize. This is the third one. Remember, e is just a number. All of this just goes to 0. So if you have that one memorized and you're looking to apply those, then the hard part's over now. Now you know your denominator's heading to 2, which means your fraction's heading to 7/2. Okay, and then the other side, we now need to plug in positive infinity and think about what happens. So same thing, just plug it in for one step. Then try to do the smallest piece of it that you can, like maybe this. This is the second one that I had suggested you memorize. A number whose exponent keeps getting bigger is just going to keep getting bigger. If you add 2 to a number that just keeps getting bigger, this is still just going to keep getting bigger. 2 faster, but in the grand scheme of infinity, adding 2 does next to nothing. And then what about this? If your numerator is stuck at 7 and your denominator just keeps getting bigger, what does this whole thing go to? 0. Very good. So whether it's 1 over infinity, 5 over infinity, 7 over infinity, but if your numerator is stuck still and your denominator is still growing, that heads to 0. Okay, so let's do that again on question 10, and then on 11 I'll give you a chance to try it before we go over it. Okay, so 10, I'm going to plug in negative infinity and try to do the smallest step possible. Because doing too much is just making the questions harder than they need to be. So I end up with this. Okay, so on this one, I'm probably just going to try to figure out what's going on with this exponent first. So I notice a positive divided by a negative. It's going to be negative. And then 2 divided by a number that goes to infinity goes to 0. Again, 1 over infinity goes to 0. 7 over infinity goes to 0. 2 over infinity goes to 0. But 0 is the only number that's the same, positive or negative. So a negative 0 is the same thing as a positive 0. And now this is the first thing that I suggest that you know. A number whose exponent goes to 0 goes to 1, which means the denominator is going to 2, and the fraction's going to negative 5/2. So I plugged in negative infinity, thought about what this fraction did, the signs, and what number it went to. Negative 0 was the same thing as positive 0, and then this was one of the 3 things that I memorized, so then it came a lot easier after that. Okay, if I plug in positive infinity and try to keep up with what's going on. Okay, if I just focus on the exponent first, 2 over infinity is going to head to 0. And now it's the same as this question. A number whose exponent goes to 0 goes to 1, which means his denominator goes to 2, which means his whole fraction goes to negative 5/2. So we don't need to graph these or anything, but if I was to graph this in my calculator, obviously I know next to nothing about what this graph looks like. This is a pretty complicated graph. But what I do know is at the far left of the graph, the y values are going to get closer and closer to negative 2.5, and the far right of the graph, the y values are going to get closer to negative 2.5. whereas the previous question, the far left of the graph, the y values would get closer to 3.5, but the far right approaches 0. I think I still have this one in. Yeah, so here's the first one. The far left approached 3/5 as x got small. In fact, x doesn't even have to really get very small before you can see that. And then as x got bigger, it approached 0, y equals 0, it's the black line. So we're just trying to figure out what this and this are doing at the far left and far right without the need of a calculator. We're trying to analyze that graph. So here was question 1. 3.5 on the left, 0 on the right. Okay, so also notice before I have you practice one, sometimes they can approach different numbers, like we saw in question 9, but they can approach the same numbers, like question 10. So you shouldn't expect them to be the same, you shouldn't expect them to be different, it just kind of depends. But go ahead and try 11 and see if you can come out with the right thing, or at least figure out where you're off or where you get stuck. So try both ends of that. And then I will share the answer, and if you got them right, you can move on to the next one, and if you don't, you can follow with me and let me help you. Okay, so for these two, let me see. I believe it should be going to 0 and -2. Did anybody get 0 and -2? Okay, sounds like some people did. So if you got that, great. You can feel free to move on to question 12 and be a step ahead of us. But if you didn't get one or both of those, you need to follow along with me and help me, or let me help you see what went different. Okay, so first one, I'm plugging in -infinity. And then I would take one step to try to figure this out. So think about the signs. A negative times a negative would be positive. And 5 times a number that just keeps getting bigger is going to be a number that just keeps getting bigger. So that exponent goes to infinity. Okay, then this guy matches up with the second thing that I suggest that you memorize. So it's not that you really have to memorize it. If you understand why this goes to infinity, you don't need to memorize it, but it does make it a touch quicker, a little bit more confidence if you know for sure why that goes that way. And so then your denominator, -3 plus a number that keeps growing, is just going to keep growing. And anytime a fraction's numerator is stuck but the denominator keeps growing, the whole thing goes to 0. That's why the first one was 0. Okay, the difference in plugging in positive infinity is going to be right away in step 1. Because now You still have 5 times infinity, which is going to be infinity, but now you have a positive times a negative, which gives you a negative. Now, this doesn't become infinity. This is this last third thing that I had suggested you memorize. This becomes 0, which means the denominator goes to -3 and the fraction goes to -2. So 0 and -2. So of course, most important there, if you did make a mistake, correct it, but also maybe circle what you did, maybe write yourself a note if you need some sort of a verbal hint for later on. And then try one more time with question 11. And I will tell you on this one, you should get 1 on both of these. So those of you that are catching on a little bit quicker and have already worked it, if you got 1 on both of those, you can move along. But everybody else, go ahead and try it, see if you get them, and then I will go over them. So if you don't get them, I will try to help you see what you should have done differently. Okay, so if you didn't get 1 in both of those directions, let's try to figure out what went off. So again, please don't try to do too much. That's easily the biggest mistake that you can make. Make one step just plugging it in. Worry about as little of it as you can at a time. I would worry about this exponent first. Negative divided by a negative would be positive, and 4 divided by a number that keeps growing would go to 0. And then this was the first of the 3 things I suggested you memorized. A number whose exponent goes to 0 goes to 1. So the denominator went to 4, so the whole fraction went to 1. Okay, I'm not going to rewrite the second one because I'm just going to make some changes because there's very little that changes here. If I plugged in positive infinity, that's going to change this, which could change this, which could change my final answer. Could, doesn't mean it will. But now, a negative divided by a positive is negative. 4 divided by a number that goes to infinity goes to 0. However, 0 is the only number that's the same whether he's positive or negative. So that still goes to 1, denominator still goes to 4, and then the whole thing still goes to 1. So sometimes they go to the same number, sometimes they don't. I think when you guys, well, let's just go ahead and move on there. So on 83, which was one of the handouts I gave you last class, there was worksheet 1 on the front that I did all of that with you, and then worksheet 2 that I gave you some class time and asked you to finish up for homework. But there was one question on the front that I didn't show you how to do, so I told you there was one question on the back that you could avoid, but that was the question type that we just talked about. So you need to go back and finish those. Do the one on the front, one on the back. If I remember right, I think one of them the numbers go to the same value, and one of them the numbers go to different values, but I guess I could be misremembering. I did upload the answer key to that on the website yesterday, so you do need to check your answers to worksheet 2. Of course, anything that you're missing would be a red flag of something to get asked about and get corrected before our quiz next class. And then finally, if you would do the front page of that test review, you don't have to do anything more than that of it. A lot of that stuff we won't get to. Some of it we won't even get to till after spring break. Some of it before, some after. But if you do the front page, that will help you get a little more practice in on 3.1, and in a couple weeks you will appreciate having one of the pages done at the test review. So, and then finally, sometime between now and next Wednesday, I would suggest you look over 82, 83, and 84. So 82 is when we did the 3.1 notes. 83 was the worksheet 1, worksheet 2. And then 84 was that extra practice, the most commonly missed question types from this section. If you look over those 3 things, then you should feel well prepared for that 3.1 quiz. I am asking for 2 of these for homework grades, so if you guys want to turn them in early, those are opened up in Google Classroom and you're welcome to. And if you'd rather just turn them in physically before the quiz on Wednesday, that is great too. But that's all I've got for you. You just need to make sure that you're okay with that stuff, that you understand what you're doing. Again, I hope that it's easy for everybody, but a lot of it just depends on, like I know the last thing we talked about, I doubt anyone learned that in Algebra 2. But most of the rest of the stuff you did, so it really just kind of depends on how well you remember it. So, as always, I will be happy to help you if there's something you need clarification on. So, call me over, bring it over here to me, and I will help you. Otherwise, that's all I've got for y'all today. Oh, also ACTM reminder. I know I've been bugging y'all about that the last few classes, but if you're interested in doing that, I am handing the money over today at lunch, so you need to give that to me before you leave class if you're wanting to do it. I cannot sign you up without your money.